House prices in Australia are well beyond the reach of many. In Sydney, house prices have risen by a third, according to Domain's House Price Index, to a median value of $1.6 million, or a rise of almost a quarter if you want to go with the official ABS statistics. That's still a big number. In fact, a phenomenal figure, isn't it? So how long can it keep on going like that? And how can we make it affordable for the next generation? Well, it's not going to be easy, but Steve Keen has an answer. We'll look at that today on the Debunking Economics podcast with Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Welcome along. Well, the opening line of Steve Keen's housing policy for the New Liberals in Australia is, if the objectives of Australian housing policy was to drive house prices out of reach of young Australians, to reduce home ownership, to increase household indebtedness, and to force non-owners into the private rental market, then it has been a resounding success. And he's written a policy paper on how to address that affordability issue. We're going to look at it today. But look, the issue is, Steve, I mean, people with houses, they want them to be worth a lot of money, don't they? They don't want affordability. They want to leverage. If you've been lucky enough to get on the housing ladder, then you want more houses, and they want to stop others getting on the housing ladder because they're going to be more people competing for those investment properties that they want to buy. I mean, more people are just going to put the prices up and make it worse for them. So straight away, you can forget about those people voting for you.
Yep, but that's the question of what percentage of the market is that? And the market now being a political market rather than just a property market. And this is where it was quite intriguing to go back and take a look at the percentage of ownership of houses from the Bureau of the ABS's census covers. And if you go back to 1989, you'll find that 43% of people owned their houses outright. Fast forward to 2018, which was the last census, it's 30%. So there's been one-third fall in the size of the percentage of people who own their homes outright. On the other side, you look at those who had mortgages. But
on top of that, you have those. I was going to say that's people who finish paying. There'll be a lot of people with mortgages.
Yeah, but the mortgages have increased, but not as much as the number of people who own their houses outright have fallen. So you find people with mortgages have gone from 30% to 37%. And then when you look at people renting, it's gone from 18% to 28%. So what we're getting is a more insecure market. The one part of it that's winning out of all that, the people who are renting to those who are, the landlords who are renting to those who have been unable to buy into the market now. And rather than being some of those who are owners or mortgages, they're now renting, and they're the main winners. But of course, again, we know that most of those people renting are renting to lose money because they're doing it to take advantage of negative gearing. So the rent they're charging is not enough to cover the interest rate on the property, the money they've borrowed to buy those investment properties. And the whole thing is factored in the belief you're going to have a continuing rising house prices.
Well, exactly. And isn't that part of the problem? I mean, that won't always be the case. So won't this problem sort of correct itself? I know people have been saying this for a long time, but it's been propped up not just by
40 years,
by government policy, but also by immigration. So if immigration to Australia slows and you get less demand for housing, you're going to have a lot of people wanting to sell houses at a premium price, the price they're expecting, probably basing their retirement on. Those prices just may not be realised, and that affordability issue starts to correct itself. It's what's being pushed at the top of the funnel, isn't it?
Well, what you have is a market that could be on the precipice of either becoming completely unaffordable, and so you lose a whole class of people who are willing to buy into the market. So you lose your buyers, which wide ends one end of the market, or you've got to insist on continuing migration into the country. And of course, COVID has knocked that for six temporarily. But the whole thing comes down to an immigration scam. And you look at it and think, this is not a healthy market. And the crazy thing is it's been made unhealthy to some large degree by government policy, because the government only really started diving into the market in 1989. Well, actually, 1983 to go right back to the very beginning, the very first time that there was a grant given to people to encourage them to buy their first home. That was under Hawke. I think that was the date here. Pardon me, I was tapping on my computer as I delay it. Yeah, October 1983. That was the first home owners scheme. And the whole idea here was to give people money so that they could buy housing. And what did it do? It drove house prices up. So everything we've done has been making house prices get higher and higher and higher. And now we're trying to, at the same time as enabling people to get into the market, I mean, when you want affordable housing, we're trying to make houses more expensive. So we're trying to achieve the impossible goal of expensive, affordable housing. And our attitude is saying, look, this has been a catastrophe. It's done the exact opposite of what policy is supposed to do. Let's look at a different policy.
But aren't we going to see that they're going to go down with interest rate rises? So interest rate rises will come to Australia because they're going everywhere. They're happening everywhere else in the world, and the RBA, even though they might believe they act independently, obviously they've got to follow. You can't have an interest rate that's low if it's high everywhere else. So interest rates will rise, perhaps by quite a bit. Isn't that going to knock the stuffing out of the housing market?
It could, but it'll knock the stuffing out of the market and knock the stuffing out of people who borrowed money as well. And you could have a financial crisis. So we're saying the only way out of this in a market sense is either to continue pumping up the market and making it less and less possible for people to buy into the housing market in the very first place, or to have drag people in from overseas and make this entirely a speculative vehicle, as it has happened in London, for example, where virtually half the homes are unoccupied. They're just being used as a way of laundering money from resource wealth and frankly crime elsewhere in the world. Or if you do have a interest rate spike that causes house prices to fall, then people who borrowed money in the belief they're going to make a profit out of selling a house on a rising market will make a loss instead, and you'll have a financial crisis. So we're saying we want to try to find a way out of this impasse, which means that people who've gained by having an increased equity in their house over time because of rising house prices don't lose out as house prices fall, and while at the same time, because house prices do fall, and that's the objective of our policy, because they do fall, they'll be more affordable for people who are currently forced to rent.
Right.
And you won't have the social breakdown we face otherwise, which I'm seeing actually even in my own family. I've got 3 members of my own family who've had to buy houses outside Sydney because they can no longer even imagine buying a house in Sydney.
Well, and guess what? I left Sydney because I could no longer afford it. That's it was definitely a factor in the decision to move out of Australia, out of Sydney, which is a beautiful place to live. It was just the size of the house that we've got in leafy Surrey here would cost millions if we were to buy it in Australia. And there's another thing, isn't it? Isn't the market adjusting because people are just getting out? I mean, it's not great for the health and wealth of a city, is it? If some of the great minds are forced to leave, but it is a bit of a correction, isn't it? I mean, it has to reach a point where it just outprices itself.
Yeah, and I think we're at that level, and we're saying
so it's not going to keep growing then on that basis.
You can't sustain it, but if you want to get out of this, we're in a dilemma. We're in an impasse. Where you want to find a way out of it that is not going to cause the whole economy to crash, and a way out of it that is not going to disadvantage people who've been disadvantaged by previous policy, which is fundamentally people who rent. And you don't want people going bankrupt or the banks even failing. You want to find a way that means we can all pull out of this and go back to the sort of situation that used to apply in the 50s and 60s when house prices were a lot lower, and where people bought a house to live in, they didn't buy it as a speculative object.
So your answer, your solution, and it's strange talking to you as a politician, which
there you go.
Which in a few months you either will be or you won't be. So either I'll be talking to you I'll be giving you a much harder time, or we'll just go back to how life was. But your solution is a monetary reset, and then rules that are going to limit the amount of mortgage debt. So trying to fix the short-term issue and then trying to create the rules that stop it happening again. So let's look at the last one first, actually, limiting the mortgage debt. So based on the income earning potential of the property. So the obvious question, how do you determine the income earning potential of a property? Well,
that's actually done very regularly. And I don't know how the Australian Bureau of Statistics is doing it these days, but they used to produce an imputed rental series. So you would have a price series which was based partly on properties which were being rented in a local government area, and then extend that to other properties which weren't being rented and say the imputed rental rate in this local government area is X dollars per week. So you do have actual data on houses that are being built to be rented out. Then you have other data on houses which are being owner-occupied, but you can impute the rent that the owner would be paying if they were renting it rather than buying it instead. So we do have a time series down to the local government area for an imputed rental rate, and we can then say, okay, given that level, you might have a bit of a 1 or 2 standard deviations around that mean, but you can then say, given that imputed rental, the maximum amount of money that can be borrowed would be, we'd start at say 20 times the annual rental income of the property, because that's pretty much the ratio that applies right now. Prices have been driven up so much that if you wanted to buy to get a mortgage to buy a house, which you would otherwise rent, the mortgage would be roughly 20 times what you'd pay in rent to rent that property for 1 year. And we're saying that's too high. We want to bring it down over a period of years from about 20 to 1, which is just too high, down to about 10 to 1. And then at a 10 to 1 ratio, then you're talking both a more sustainable rental yield, but also a more sustainable price.
But if you are attaching it to geography like that, because of course land value changes over time, there'll be neighbourhoods which are being regentrified or which are for whatever reason are seeing their values going up. You could be tying that ability for that area to see its land values increase, because you're tying it down to the ratio that you're setting. I'm just wondering whether you could achieve that, whether you need to have that geographic consideration in there.
You probably do, but even so, the geographic will take care of itself in the sense that it'll be on a local government area basis. You wouldn't be saying that that there's a set rental price for the whole of Australia. You'd be saying there's a rental price for Vaucluse, there's a rental price for Cogra, a rental price for Perth, etc., at the local government area. And so there'd be, a 3-bedroom house in one region might have a higher price than a 3-bedroom house in another, because the rent is higher for that house in that different region. So the rents, the real thing about tying it to rental income is you're saying you want to base the capital price of something on the income that capital can generate, not let it get totally out of control, which is what's happened with the speculation we've encouraged in the last 30 years.
Couldn't you do the same thing, though, by just limiting the amount of money that the banks lend out? So, limit the loans.
Well, that's worked really well.
But if you had a more radical approach to it, like you're talking about, so you said, well, okay, we're going to attach it to the income earning potential. But we are just set on a national basis, and we're going to say to commercial banks, okay, this is how much property is being sold in the market. This is how much you can issue loans for. Almost exactly the same thing, but you're actually limiting the commercial banks rather than setting the price in the housing market. Because in your model, who's actually setting that? Who's actually saying, well, no, you can't borrow for that much because it's more than this ratio of loans?
Well, it'd come out of the Bureau of Statistics. You simply say if the rental income of a property was say $20,000 per year.
So it's illegal. It's illegal for the bank to lend someone that money to
it'd be illegal control. Yeah, right.
Yeah. Oh, it's illegal for you to buy the property for a value that's more than that.
Illegal to borrow more money against it than 10 times the rental income. Okay, and the reason for this is that when you look at what happens at the moment with people who want to buy a particular...
To borrow or pay for it?
Huh?
Because I could go...
Borrow.
Right, but I could go to bank of mum and dad and get some money from them. Because then if borrowing obviously is based on how much money you've already got. Surely it's got to be based on the final value of the house.
We're trying to get leverage out of the equation. We're trying to get leverage out of the equation of determining house prices, because leverage has been the thing determining house prices for the last 30 or 40 years, and it's got us into this unsustainable level of house prices.
But if you're basing it on, people who are buying investment properties obviously are leveraging high as well. But it does mean that people who've got money which is sitting around and they're wondering what to do with it, they could be saying, well, okay, we're going to buy up everyone else is constrained now by the price of houses, by how much they can borrow. So we're in a better position here because we've got the cash sitting around. We can go and buy those houses and pay less than we would have had to before because people can borrow less. But we've got the money.
Why would they buy them? Now, the reason they're buying houses right now is they expect the house price to rise.
Yeah.
Okay. So we want to break the cycle between rising house prices and therefore a willingness to take on more, to pay higher prices for houses now. The whole positive feedback loop that is driving us into higher and higher levels of household debt. So we want to break that loop. And the only way to break it is to say that there's no longer an encouragement to take on more debt than the person you're competing against to buy a property. Because even though you can talk about individuals who have a higher level of income than others to buy a property, and they're going to buy those in expensive suburbs. We're not going to change that. What we're looking at, the vast majority of people, the middle class and the young and poor in the society, we want them to be able to afford to buy a house in regions they're going to look at that somebody who lives in Vaucluse is not going to look at. So we want to break the damage that's being done to the capacity of people to own a home in their own society. And one way to do that is to say, well, we're going to remove the incentive to borrow more money in buying a house, because most of the time you're going to be competing against somebody much like yourself to buy a property. And at the moment, the way you win that competition is you borrow more money than the other guy. So if the other person is borrowing $1 million and you borrow 1.1 million, you win, and therefore you actually want the banks to offer you more leverage. And we're saying we're going to rule that out. The banks can't do it. If the property is going to rent for, say, $50,000 a year, then the most anybody can borrow to buy it, once we've got our 10-to-1 rule into place, is going to be $500,000. If you want to buy it against somebody else, you've got to save more money than the other person. So it breaks down that encouragement that we currently all face to want to be in more debt. And that's the last thing anybody really wants to be in. Yeah. You only want to be in more debt because you think you're going to make a capital gain out of it. Let's get that out of the housing market. And that's the objective of that particular part of the policy.
So that debt, of course, expands the money supply. Does that matter? Does that factor into the equation at all?
No, it doesn't.
Well, I mean, because most of the money that's coming is coming from commercial banks that are issuing mortgages. That's how the money supply is increasing, isn't it?
That's true. That's how the money has increased in the past. And that's a mistake. We've allowed far too much of the money supply to be created by banks financing speculation.
Yeah,
if the
should be provided by governments. So spending it on
both government and also by banks providing working capital for corporations. I'm very happy to have banks create money to enable a business to start, which looks like it's going to be profitable to both the bank and the business owner.
Does that still
enable,
Huh? Does that still?
Well,
do banks still do that?
It won't happen while banks think they can make money by financing speculation on bricks and mortar. Yeah. And this is the brain dead level of Australian banking these days. I mean, I've had, being who I am, I've had quite a few interesting conversations with people who tell me things they shouldn't tell me over time. So one person who told me things they shouldn't tell me was the guy who designed most of the software that's involved in the 30-second evaluations of loan applications. I won't say for which bank. And he said that basically,
which bank?
They literally, the target was to get the evaluation time down to 30 seconds worth of filling out a form, bang, and get the answer back. Another guy was an ex-bank manager I met him as a taxi driver. He said his main job these days was driving around not to check and see whether a property met the standards that are supposedly stated on the contract of sale, to just see if there was actually a bloody house on the property in the first place. So the standards have dropped like a brick, and it dropped like a brick is a good analogy. So we want to stop them.
You could save a lot of time to get Google Earth to do that, couldn't you? Just if there's some.
Yeah. So get rid of that particular encouragement to leverage and speculation by a rule that says you can't use leverage anymore to beat your opponent in buying a property. You've got to save money instead.
But don't people generally, I must admit I'm guilty of this as well, you get to a certain age where you're starting to think, well, we need to add value to the house. And you're not thinking about yourself. You're actually thinking about the kids. But you're also thinking about your retirement as well. So you buy up based on how much you're gonna pass over. And I'm just wondering, the issue we've got obviously is intergenerational inequality. That's the core issue here, isn't it? It's the fact
that we actually make an appeal directly to that and say, we can't have this increase in intergenerational inequality getting any worse than it is, because we'll break down the social compact of the country if we let it get any worse.
But if you pushed up inheritance tax, and then that would factor into. Because people aren't necessarily making money out of their investment properties, are they? For example, they're looking at it based on the value of that property going up, and they're thinking about how that's going to get passed on. But if you had higher inheritance taxes, which I know is a massively unpopular idea with most people, but then that would be factored into capital investment, wouldn't it, for people? And they might be less keen to invest in many properties if they know that whatever money they're going to make, they're going to lose it in tax at the end of the day anyway.
Yeah, well, you notice that a capital tax wasn't part of the policy. Again, I can see attempts to tax and control tend to lead to attempts to evade control, and also, of course, give you a policy which is ultimately unpopular. Taxation is always unpopular, so it ends up shooting yourself in the foot if you're trying to bring about actual social change. Leading with a tax is not often the best way to go about it. So we've done the twofold. One is the control on the leverage, and the other is one we haven't started talking about yet, which we should discuss.
Yeah,
and that's the monetary reset.
Yeah. We're getting onto that. Just one more thing though on the price of houses. What about, because this isn't going to address the issue of how many houses are built. It in fact, it's going to constrain the income potential, which could mean developers are less keen to build. So could you actually be constraining supply with this policy? And just before you answer that, what about social housing? Because Australia has bugger all of it on an international scale. And if you actually got up to the point where... So I'll give you some figures, for example.
Okay.
In Australia, less than 5% of all housing stock is social housing. In the Netherlands, for example, a third of all houses are social housing. So if you move from 5% to 30% or 35%, you'd see house prices go down, wouldn't you? Because a lot of those investment properties that people were renting out would suddenly find that their rental market has now gone to social housing, and that would have two benefits. One, it would mean that there's still that demand for houses to be built, and secondly, you are helping people who are struggling.
Look, I'm definitely in favour of more social housing. I mean, again, if you look at the Australian stats we lead that document with, there's been pretty much a halving in the level of people with in government as opposed to private rental. So, yes, there's been a decline in the extent to which people have social housing, whether that's social housing they rent or social housing they buy. And like Singapore, which is one of the world's most successful capitalist nations, has one of the highest levels of social housing. So it's actually pulling housing out of the equation of a way to make wealth, and saying if you want to create wealth, create a business rather than creating a housing bubble. So they're definitely not against having social housing. That will be part of what we write up as overall, but the focus of this policy was making housing affordable again to buy. And so we're focused just on reducing the leverage with the second policy we've discussed, and the monetary reset to mean that people who've gained out of the bubble so far don't lose, because we're going to now bring house prices down.
Right, but what about that? My point about constraining supply. If houses are going to be worth less, aren't you going to see developers less keen to build, and so you just end up with less? Well,
they're not particularly keen to build anyway to begin with. I mean, the extent to which there's land banking and so on in Australia is quite extreme. But one of the most interesting surveys I've seen on that front is the Demographia survey. I don't know if it still exists, but it was started by a New Zealand property developer, and he was very angry about the level of house prices, that they're too high. They don't reflect the cost of building the house. They reflect the cost of the land, which is driven up by speculation. And his argument was that a house should cost about 3.5 years' salary. And he thought that was sustainable. And the leverage level we're talking about is also in the same ballpark. So it should be profitable to make a house for something of the order of 3 times the annual income of the person buying the house. And then you've got... that's a much lower level of cost than we're talking about to buy property now, because 90% of the price you're paying is for the inflated value of the land, and that reflects the leverage that's been developed by the amount of borrowing that people are doing to compete with each other to buy those properties.
So even though, houses are so expensive and so unaffordable, we've still got 65% of homes in Australia owner-occupied. They're the figures I've got, and that sort of goes with the figures you had about how many have been paid outright and how much are still paying off their mortgage. In Germany, very capitalist economy, 51% are owner-occupied. Same for Hong Kong. In Switzerland, it's 41%. Lots of these countries have got used to the idea that you rent.
Yeah, well, but the thing is, that's another thing about land tenure in Australia. Rental rights are dreadful in Australia. In Germany, I think you probably know this, when you're a renter in Germany, you're expected to supply the kitchen. Okay, because it's a capital investment and you're expected to be there for 10 or 15, 20 years. And you have rental rights. I mean, you can't be thrown out. You don't have to ask the landlord whether you can bang a nail into the wall to hang a painting. You just go ahead and do it. So the rental rights in Australia, as well as the prices being too high, the rights for tenants are dreadful, and that's one reason that drives people out of the market, out of the rental market in the first place. They want to go and buy a property because they're sick and tired of being screwed by a landlord. So we have to change the power relations between landlords and renters, as well as changing the power relations between the banking sector and the housing sector.
Right, the Great Reset. I'll leave this for
Hey, finally got there.
A half-hour discussion. We've only got 5 minutes left, so maybe we have to come back to this. But look, I can see this idea is that, yes, we try and balance things out. So we try and get rid of as much debt as possible. So if you've got debt from housing, we put a slug of money into your bank account, and if you haven't got debt from housing, well, congratulations, you get the same slug of money, so you've got more money that you can go out and spend. I can see how this is going to go down in the media. Everyone's going to go, free money. Well, what a crackpot idea that is. What is if you did it, it would be a shock to the system, wouldn't it? If you did this all at once, you'd have a lot of extra capacity, a lot of extra money, which presumably is going to be sitting with the RBA's balance sheet. Ultimately, the government issues bonds. So as we've been seeing during the COVID crisis, the government issues bonds to cover the debt that they've incurred by paying all this money to everybody. The RBA buys up those bonds, so it sits on their balance sheet. So it's, in effect, that's new money that's been created. So there would be this rapid expansion in the money supply. There's going to be implications for that if it's done all at once.
And that means you haven't read the policy carefully enough, because that's modelled and shown that without leaving out interest rates being paid on the bonds, there'd be no change in the money supply. The idea is to swap money which is currently based by private debt and back it by fiat instead. So if you tell people that if you make it a necessity that the money you get is used to pay your debt down, then
right. So it disappears from the bank. Right. Got you.
Yeah. The money remains constant. Okay. Without interest being paid on the bonds themselves.
Except for those who don't have that debt. So you're still expanding it. But that's for people who have the debt that are paying it down. Those people who don't have debt, that would be new
bonds.
money.
They get bonds.
Right.
Okay. They don't get money. Now, the idea is that those bonds could be sold to purchase a house at a later stage. They could be part of a deposit for a house. But the whole idea is you're not creating money out of it. What you are doing, and this is what
you're getting like a property bond. Also, it's
a government bond. At the moment, we're doing exactly the same thing that is done right now for the government to create money when it runs a deficit, and then to issue bonds so that the reserves which are created by the deficit are converted into bonds for the banks, and the bonds then earn interest for the banks. Now, the bonds can also be sold by the banks to the public, and when the banks do that, that reduces the money supply, because people pay for those bonds by handing over their deposits. The deposits fall, so the amount of money in circulation falls. Their bonds rise. They've got bonds which earn an income for them independently. But we do the same thing now, where the bonds would go to people who currently have no bank balance. They would be getting a monetary reset out of this, which would compensate for the fact that as renters they've been screwed for the last 40 years.
So Joe Lindsay raises a few interesting questions. One is, how do you determine who gets the money? But more important,
everybody does.
Right. So, but that's easier than it sounds. I mean, I probably shouldn't say this, but my wife got $1,200 from the Australian government just because she holds an American government, I should say, because she holds an American passport.
Well, don't say the American. Now you've got the green card after you. That's a bad move.
Well, that's right. Probably shouldn't have said that. But the point is that, the money, and we know when money was paid by the Australian government as well, it went to people who weren't living in the country necessarily. So it's, but I guess, there's going to be people who benefit just on the periphery who probably shouldn't. In reality, how simple is that going to be? I could see that opens itself to corruption. Particularly just as we saw, for example, with payments being made for COVID, there's now a question of people who got it who shouldn't, and enormous legal action that's going to follow.
Well, if everybody's getting the same amount of money, that's the main leveler. No matter how many houses you own, no matter how much wealth you have, you get exactly the same amount of money as somebody else.
And well, what sort of figure are we talking about?
The same amount of money. Pardon?
What sort of number? What sort of number are we talking about?
Well, if you wanted to reduce the level of debt by 100% of GDP, which is pretty much what you want to do. Housing debt right now is about, household debt is about of the order of 110, 120% of GDP. It should be down at 10%. 20% of GDP, which is what it was before this speculative bubble began. So you'd be looking at injecting something equivalent to 1 year's GDP of money into the economy in such a way that you didn't change the money supply. You simply converted from being backed by debt to backed by fiat money.
So how much would that be per person, just roughly?
I worked that out for America at one point. It was about $100,000 per person.
Right. Okay. So I wonder whether that's enough to make a difference. I've got a debt on my mortgage of, for example, just picking a figure from $500,000. You give me 100 million. You give me 100,000.
100,000.
Sorry, I know exactly. You give me 100. You give me 100,000. That's what I meant to say. So I've still got debt of 400,000.
Yeah, you've still got the other debt. Yeah, it's still there.
And if I didn't,
most people would still find themselves in debt after the process. But those who didn't have debt would have would have bonds. And largely, when you look at how we've screwed the rent, people who rent have never gotten any money out of the government. Okay, they're the ones who have been screwed overall, and they're a rising percentage of the population. They're certainly the younger part of the population. So we'd be compensating for 40 years of them being screwed by all the policies being directed towards older people and towards people who have property, and we're getting the property less money to compensate for them being discriminated against for the last 40 years.
Given 100,000 is a lot of money, but I'm just wondering whether it's enough to make any difference, because without the second or the first part where you're trying to limit the value of a loan to the rental value of a property, if you told me you were going to give me 100,000, I'd just pay off my house that little bit quicker. But I might use that to leverage against buying another property as well, given the housing market.
Well, what we do is we say it can't be done that way. Okay, it's you either pay your debt off or you get government bonds which might earn you 5% interest, that sort of thing. And it's feasible then to say, well, those bonds can be used as a deposit for buying a house, because there'd probably be a lot of landlords who'd be wanting to sell rental properties. And you want to be able to enable people to have a deposit to buy those rental properties. So it's feasible to do that way. But overall, the objective is to reduce house prices without reducing the equity that people currently have in their house. We haven't really spoken about this properly. So if you have a house...
No, because this is a topic that we could talk about for 2 hours, isn't it? But just finishing off on this point, because we've run out of time today, but maybe we need to come and revisit again next week. But if I've got that $500,000 mortgage and you give me 100,000, so I've now got a mortgage of 400,000 with a property that's still worth what it was last week. I'm going to go to I don't know how you'd stop me saying, well, okay, I'm going to go to the bank now because my mortgage is less. I've got more equity, so I can invest in another property. Thank you very much. I don't know how you...
And we're going to say we limit the amount of money you can borrow. Okay, it's why it takes 2 policies to do it, not just one. You've got to limit the capacity for that speculation to happen again.
Yeah, you can't do one without the other. Absolutely. Yeah.
That's right. You've got to do them together.
Yeah. All right. Okay. All right. Very good. Well, let's see how you go with that.
One to return to.
Do you know, but the problem is, Steve, I mean, I'm sure it's brilliant, but it's not bite-sized chunk stuff for a politician, is it?
No, it's not. It's not. But what we're having is bite-sized chunks for people who are currently renting and can see no possibility of them getting into the market in the future. And this is a way of fighting back, in effect, rather than having to decide to pull up stumps and move to the back of Burke to be able to buy a property, which is what they face at the moment, with all the resentment that's going to raise to the social contract in Australia.
Yeah, but that's how property moves, isn't it? People get outpriced from cities. I know a lot of people who've moved to Brisbane, which is also very expensive, but they've moved there simply because they couldn't afford to live in Sydney. So it's a little bit cheaper in Brisbane. So the Brisbane economy starts to boom. The Sydney economy starts to wither. And so it goes on since the dawn of time.
I think it's since the dawn of property speculation, not since the dawn of time.
All right, very good. All right, leave it there. Good to talk, Steve. We'll definitely revisit this again. See you next week.
Okay, mate. Okay, bye.
The issue is, of course, as we started the whole interview, 67 or 65% of people in Australia are homeowners, and you're telling them that they're going to see their values of their properties decline. That's going to be a difficult one to win, isn't it? But the sad thing is, of course, there's really no discussion happening at all about this in Australia, and it's the sort of thing you obviously do need to talk about. That's it for this week. Back again with Steve next week. I'm Phil Dobbie. Thanks for listening.